spaces for meaningful dialogue. We believe that everyone has something unique to bring to these political, economic, social, and cultural conversations, and we don't shy away from the hard conversations about current events. We endeavor to be a beacon of hope and understanding, while boldly challenging listeners to think more deeply about difficult topics that impact us all. With this in mind, our mission statement at KBLA Talk 1580 is simple: to create an inclusive platform that promotes civil discourse through honest dialogue and encourages personal growth among our listeners, so they can become the active agents of change. Our vision is to establish ourselves as the premier radio network with relevant programming across the beloved community, connecting people through shared experiences and collective power for lasting impact beyond these challenging times.
Live from Leimert Park, USA, I'm Avi Bernardin for Tavis Smiley. Thank you for joining us on KBLA 1580 AM on your dial, also on our free KBLA app, and of course on YouTube. You can't get Tavis Smiley, you'll settle for who? That would be me. We've got a great show for you today. In this first hour, we're going to be talking to David Schultz, who is a professor of political science at Hamline University, teaches a wide range of American politics classes, including public policy and administration, campaigns and elections, and government ethics, which are at the forefront right now. Hour number 2, we're going to be talking to Dr. Doris Molina Henry about Alzheimer's in the Black community, something that touches so many of us on such a deep level. And in hour number 3, we're going to be talking to Stephanie Boyer about the future of sales and how AI is making an impact. But let's get right into our conversation with David Schultz, professor at Hamline University. Professor Schultz, thank you so much for joining us. Professor Schultz, I got you on the line. Check 1 2, Mike. Check 1 2. We're having some issues with Professor Schultz's line. We're going to get him on in just a moment, but we have a lot to talk about. We're going to be talking to Professor Schultz about the Supreme Court, which has been making disastrous decision after disastrous decision, talking about affirmative action, talking about LGBTQ rights, and just we're really seeing the impact. You know, people say, oh, well, Joe Biden and Donald Trump, they're the same. I'm not going to vote. Why would I vote? They're the same. Joe Biden is just the lesser of two evils. That's not the case. And now we're seeing the ramifications of all those people who didn't vote in 2016 when Hillary Clinton was on the ballot. If Hillary Clinton had been elected, then we would not be dealing with so many of these issues. But let's see if we have David Schultz on the line now. David Schultz, do I have you on the line?
We do. For some reason, the phone went dead for a minute.
No worries. So glad to have you here. And so there's so much going on with the Supreme Court right now. I want to get right to it and get your top line response when you saw those decisions coming down at the end of last week with affirmative action and the LGBTQ rights case specifically.
Well, the simple answer is I'll use a trite phrase, but it's popular. Elections matter. This is what you were talking about here. Elections matter at the end of the day, and who's president matters, who's in the Senate matters, who's in the House matters. And as you said, we elected Hillary Clinton back in 2016, there would have been 3 Supreme Court appointments that would not have been made by Donald Trump. They would have been made by Hillary Clinton, and we would have not had those decisions that we saw last week. And so that's important to understand, is that there's a connection between voting, who's in office, and what the court does.
Three Supreme Court appointments for Donald Trump. That is a third of the court. A third by one guy who, by such clear evidence, by all accounts that matter, should have never been in office in the first place. And it's just mind-boggling that this man was able to appoint 3 Supreme Court justices who are going to be on the bench for life. And that's, I don't know, what is it, 2023? We might be talking 2050, 2060 before some of them are out of that chamber. And so I want to get to some of the specifics of these cases, and
Right.
and you've written a wonderful article going into detail about how the Supreme Court, in trying to be colorblind, they're actually being color oblivious. But just before we get to that, I want to ask you about how is there a realistic path to imposing some kind of term limits on these justices? Because right now, the prospects of having a more balanced court don't seem very good. It doesn't feel like we're anywhere near getting somewhere close to something fair, especially considering that a couple of those seats were stolen. So is there any realistic path that we could have either term limits or add additional seats to the Supreme Court in the next several years?
Sure. Okay. In terms of term limits, probably not, because we'd have to amend the Constitution. And to amend the Constitution, it takes 2/3 of both houses of Congress and 3/4 of the states. And let's just be honest, we're not going to get 2/3 of Congress and 3/4 of the states to agree, especially with all those Republican leading representatives, senators, and states. So that's out. On the other hand, the size of the court in terms of the number of justices is not fixed. And over time, it's been as few as, I think, 5 justices, and has grown, I think, at one point to 10 justices right before the Civil War. So imagine a scenario where Democrats hold on to the presidency. They also hold on to the Senate, and they pick up the House of Representatives next time. Let's imagine, I don't know, the Supreme Court Justice Act of 2020, was it 2025, or like that, where what we decide to do is expand the size of the court by, I don't know, let's say maybe 6 justices or something like that. So now it goes up to 15, and it gives a second-term Joe Biden the opportunity to appoint 6 justices to the court. Well, that might now flip it around in a different way. And so, yes, I think that's a possibility, but people have to think about it. People need to, when they go and vote next year, don't say, I'm not excited by Biden, or he's just another, old white guy, et cetera, et cetera. Think of it in terms of the eyes on the prize, that at the end of the day, if this court doesn't get flipped, we're going to get even more decisions like we saw, in the last few weeks or something like that. So it's really, really important to show up to vote, especially if you're in those critical states. If you're listening in Georgia, you're listening in Arizona, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, if you're there, those are the big states that are going to decide the election. I mean, we know California. California, unless something crazy happens, it's going to vote Democrat. You need, in those critical states, to basically show up and vote. Tell your friends, show up to vote, get there, get motivated, because that's really important to be able to do that.
And I'm glad you're making that point, because we do have listeners in those states and all over the country. And that would be quite a favorable outcome if indeed Joe Biden did get reelected and the Democrats did flip the House and maintain the Senate, because the Senate map is very daunting as we look ahead to 2024. Not many good chances for the Democrats to flip, and a lot of tough seats for the Democrats to defend, including John Tester in Montana is one I'm particularly worried about. You have Joe Manchin up for re-election. Oh boy. So we're going to talk about that, about this article that you've written for Counterpunch. It just came out on Friday, June 30th, right before the holiday weekend. It's called "The Supreme Court's Color Oblivious Constitution and the Road Not Taken." You have just some really, really incredible points in this article, and I want to dive into that when we come forward right here on KBLA Talk 1580.
We've got a lot to talk about. Good thing we've got 3 hours. More of Tavis Smiley when we come forward.
She's so smooth. So I'm interrupting my own shower to remind you to treat your skin like the queen she is with Olay Hyaluronic Body Wash, packed with Olay's highest level of vitamin B3 complex. It's so moisturizing that it will give you visibly smoother, head-turning skin in just 14 days. People wondering, how'd she get so smooth? Olay Hyaluronic Body Wash. Also, try Olay Hyaluronic Body Lotion.
Don't miss July 4th savings now at Lowe's. Freshen up your home with buy one, get one 50% off on select interior and exterior paints and exterior stains via Lowe's gift card rebate. And get gardening with savings on Stay Green soil. Right now, buy 3 bags for just $10. Lowe's knows July 4th savings. Lowe's knows home improvement. Offers valid through 7/5. Soil offer excludes Alaska and Hawaii, and selection varies by location. While supplies last, more terms and restrictions apply. See Lowe's.com/rebates for details.
The $5 cravings box is back at Taco Bell, and it's the real thing. We're talking a Chalupa Supreme, a cheesy, beefy 5-layer burrito, a crunchy taco, cinnamon twist, and a medium drink, all for just $5. That's a lot of food for not a lot of dollars. In other words, a wise business deal, like greeting clients with a firm handshake and a delicious 3-course meal. That's only $5. Order your $5 cravings box on the Taco Bell app today. At limited participating U.S. Taco Bell locations for a limited time only while supplies last. Contact local store for price and participation which vary. Drinks exclude freezes. Price excludes tax.
Some people won't give you the real talk on drugs, but it's time we know the facts. Fentanyl is killing people. It's a powerful opioid, often made illegally and commonly mixed with illicit drugs. It can even be pressed into counterfeit pills that resemble prescription medications. Just 2 milligrams, about the size of a few grains of sand, could potentially be lethal. This isn't an ad to scare you, but it is an ad to make you think twice. Get the facts. Go to realdealonfentanyl.com. This message is brought to you by the Ad Council.
Are you looking to steer your career in a new direction? Driving for Culver City Bus can be your ticket to a long-lasting career with excellent benefits and paid training. Culver City Bus is looking for customer service and safety-minded bus operators to join the growing team. Culver City Bus offers on-the-job training starting at $19.10 per hour, uniform allowance, and health benefits. Culver City Bus is a great employer. Let Culver City Bus connect you with an essential service job. If you enjoy driving, seek real opportunities for career advancement, and passionate about making a difference in the community, you are invited to join the Culver City Bus team. Start your journey today by submitting an application at culvercity.org/jobs. For more info, visit culvercitybus.com or call live customer service operators at 310-253-6500.
Let's unpack a little bit more with Tavis Smiley. The conversation continues right now.
It's Avi Bernard in for Tavis Smiley this morning. Thank you for joining us. We do realize you have so many things you could be doing with your time, and you are here with us. We so appreciate you, and we are joined by David Schultz, Hamline University professor of political science and author of many books. And Professor Schultz, I want to talk about this article you have in Counterpunch, and you use the term color oblivious. And the court is trying to be colorblind, and of all people, Clarence Thomas are saying, affirmative action flies in the face of the idea that America is colorblind, and it's complete haberdashery.
Right.
But talk about this term color oblivious that you use. What does that mean?
Sure. Okay. So the court likes to talk about how the conservatives on the court, how the Constitution is supposed to be colorblind. It's supposed to be race neutral. What's that phrase on the outside of the Supreme Court? Equal justice for all, or the picture of the statue. The blindfold justice is blind. That's the image. The idea that somehow the law is neutral. That somehow if the law refers not at all to race. Racism goes away, and therefore any kind of considerations of race, such as in admissions or hiring or wherever it may be, is perpetuating racism. And what I argue is that the term that really describes the court is not race neutral, it's race obliviousness, because in saying that the law ought to be colorblind, as you pointed out, the court is ignoring what? 500 years, was it 400 years of history? It starts, with America starts with slavery. It starts with the subjection of Indians. It somehow the court thinks that if we just stop talking about race, if we just ignore it, it'll go away. And I can't imagine any of your listeners believing something like that. But that's what I was trying to make the point, is that the court is saying that, listen, 20 years ago, we issued a decision, and Justice O'Connor, in that decision, the court said, yeah, we're going to still allow for race to be considered as one of several factors in college admission. But we're hoping in 25 years that we'll be beyond that. Well, what the court said is last week, we're beyond it. Enough with affirmative action, enough with considerations of race. Let's just pretend race doesn't exist. To me, that's race oblivious.
Very well said. And this isn't the only instance in which the Supreme Court has tried to make it seem like race doesn't matter anymore. They gutted the Voting Rights Act.
Correct.
And what was it, 2013, 2014? And
yep.
and we've seen the ramifications of that. And that was Chief Justice Roberts' thing. Oh, well, we don't need the Voting Rights Act anymore. It's race isn't a thing in America anymore. And it is really oblivious to think that, and that is a sign of white privilege. If you can see it in that way, that's a sign that you've never had to deal with any of these things, and because you wouldn't if you're not a person of color. And it really is disturbing, and you go on in your article to talk about so many of the decisions that the Supreme Court has made throughout history, dating back to the 1800s with the Dred Scott decision, in which the Supreme Court ruled that slaves were property and not people, and 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson declaring that separate but equal was acceptable. That it was acceptable, even though separate but equal has never been realistic, and things were separate but never equal. And how can you kind of connect the dots between some of those decisions back in the 1800s, and we'll get to some of the more recent decisions here shortly. Sure. But to those two decisions specifically, Dred Scott versus Sanford and Plessy versus Ferguson in 1857 and 1896 respectively. How can you tie those decisions into what we're seeing today and last week from the Supreme Court's affirmative action decision?
Sure. Let's start with Dred Scott versus Sanford, where the court said that, again, as you correctly stated here, the court ruled and said people who are descended from Africa, who are African Americans, that's not the term they used back then. I won't use that term on the air.
Appreciate that.
They said, they said that they were never intended to be considered persons with rights. They were property. And the reason why I emphasize that is for people like Clarence Thomas and for other members of the court who say, listen, we need to go back and interpret the Constitution from the way it was originally intended, from the intent of the framers. Well, if we do that, then heck, no African Americans would ever have any rights whatsoever. In fact, except, as I tell my students, except for a bunch of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant males who have a lot of money and own lots of property, none of us would have any rights. And so that's the first point is I want to make it there, is that our Constitution, right from the start, is intertwined with racism and slavery. And then the Plessy versus Ferguson that said separate but equal is okay. Well, as you pointed out, it was never equal. It was, at the schools that were separated were never equal. The separate water fountains, the separate facilities, it created this fiction that somehow said that, yeah, if we have separate but equal, that's perfectly okay. And that's to me is part of the sort of the deep roots of this racial obliviousness is ignoring what's happening in the real world, whether intentionally or I like the way you said it in terms of saying that if you don't realize that there's white privilege, that's probably white privilege in and of itself, or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's exactly what was going on with those early decisions in terms of just again turning a complete blind eye to what. I don't know. I'm hoping most of us can see. I point out the fact that I'm in St. Paul, Minnesota.
Mm-hmm.
I am approximately 6 miles from where George Floyd was murdered. I mean, it is pretty easy to figure out where I'm sitting and where I'm standing. That race still matters in our society, and unfortunately, probably for every one of your listeners across the country, they can point to some situation where they say, "Hey, Supreme Court, here's how race matters."
I really appreciate how you just threaded that, because you said that this version of the Supreme Court today in their ruling on affirmative action was saying that, well, it would go back to the Constitution, but then when you go back to the Dred Scott decision, and they're saying that, well, if you go back to the Constitution, it says that that they weren't meant to have rights, and so they're both saying opposite things, and they're using it just because it works for them in that moment, but they're saying opposite things. But you mentioned that there's racism intertwined all throughout the Constitution. Can you just go through one or two of those ways, just for our listeners who may not be familiar?
Sure. Okay, a couple of ways to think about it here. One is that during the Constitutional Convention, when the free states and the northern states, free states and the slave states were trying to fight over representation on issues of like, okay, we're creating a Congress, we're going to create a House of Representatives based upon population. The southern states said, well, we want to count the slaves for the purposes of representation, but we don't want to count slaves in terms of allowing them to vote. And the North objected, and they came up with the famous 3/5 compromise, which basically said that people who were they never used the word slave. They always used other persons, this phrase. They said other persons would count as 3/5. Essentially, if we could do an equation here, 3/5 of you, or rather, I should put it this way: for every 5 African Americans, it equals three white guys. That's one way. Or the fact that the Senate, every state gets 2 senators, was a compromise also with the slave states. And James Madison, explicitly said this at one point and said that if we don't give the southern states, some of the things they want, they're not going to enter the Union. And so the fact that we give smaller states, at least at that point, they were the southern states, more and rural states, more representation in the Senate. Or let me put it this way: they get same representation as a California or as a New York. Also favors of slavery. But the debate at the Constitutional Convention over the issues of how do we deal with slaves, how do we deal with who gets the right to vote, when we eventually, since they couldn't agree on it, because the southern states said, well, we don't want to talk about voting rights because then we have to deal with the issue of do slaves get voting rights. We have in the original Constitution no language about the right to vote. And so for anybody who wants to say that the Constitution was race neutral, they're foolish. One of the quotes I like to use is back in 1987, Thurgood Marshall, former Supreme Court justice, wrote this wonderful speech, and he said in 1787, the first 3 words of the Constitution are "we the people," and he said it really was what? We, the white, rich, slave-owning people, not all of us. And I think that captures it really well in terms of who the framers were and who they wanted to give power to. And the way I say to my students sometimes, is it any coincidence that the people who were allowed to vote back then, the people who were in power back then, look a heck of a lot like the same people who vote now, who are in power now, who run the major corporations who serve in Congress? Is it by coincidence or is it by design? I don't know about you. It kind of sounds like design to me.
Yeah, coincidence is probably a bit too hard to imagine. It's Avi Bernard in for Tavis Smiley. We're speaking with David Schultz, Hamline University professor of political science. He's also the author of Presidential Swing States, Why Only 10 Matter, a book called Election Law and Democratic Theory, and also a book called American Politics in the Age of Ignorance, Why Lawmakers Choose Belief Over Research. And that title in and of itself is very profound, and we could have a conversation on that title alone. But Professor Schultz, I do want to talk about, something else you said in your article, and in which you're saying that it was an illusion to say that simply by passing a law making discrimination illegal would make discrimination disappear. And so in about, we have about 90 seconds before we have to step aside for a brief moment, but I want to get your take, and if we have to continue on the other side, that's fine. But why is it that, in your opinion, simply making discrimination illegal won't make it disappear?
Well, in the same way, let's use a parallel here. Back in the 1920s, we passed an amendment called Prohibition that said we're going to prohibit in the consumption, sale, et cetera, alcohol. Did that mean it went away? Of course not. It didn't.
Got more popular.
How about for the last? That's right. How about for the last 50 years, we've waged 50 years, like it says, a war on drugs. Does anybody think that by ratcheting up the penalties and by saying we're going to send you to jail, et cetera, it has done anything to address drug use in America? Of course not. Simply passing laws doesn't matter. If simply passing laws change people's behavior, then what? Nobody would speed. Nobody would steal, nobody would murder, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it's kind of this naive idea. And the same thing here is that, yes, our political legal institutions are imbued with racism. But they're also, at the end of the day, it's deep-seated social attitudes. It's beliefs. It's, prejudice and bias and hate, racism is yes, institutional. But it's also what's psychological. It's part of our society, and just by simply saying we're going to get rid of it at the legal stage, forgets the fact that there's still people have to enforce the laws, still people that are entrusted with administering them. People still have to obey them. And just by you passing a law doesn't mean you get rid of racism.
And those people administering those laws often have bias themselves. Professor David Schultz, we're going to continue this conversation about the Supreme Court and why this affirmative action decision was so extreme right after news, traffic, and sports right here on KBLA Talk 1580.
Be sure to like and follow Tavis Smiley at The Real Tavis Smiley and get Twitter updates at Tavis Smiley. The conversation continues when we come forward.
I'm Ray Harris, and here's the latest from the Black Information Network. 10 people are dead and 38 are wounded in 3 separate mass shootings in the United States over the 4th of July holidays. In Fort Worth, 3 people were killed and 8 wounded in a shooting late Monday after a local Independence Day festival.
What happened was unimaginably disgusting and horrifying.
In Philadelphia, 5 people were killed and 2 were wounded when a suspect in body armor opened fire on a group of strangers.
That we do not see a basis for concluding that that person's discharge of a firearm was illegal.
In Baltimore, Maryland, 2 people were shot and killed, 28 injured early Sunday in a mass shooting at a neighborhood block party. President Biden condemns the violence, and that's the latest. I'm Ray Harris on your home for 24/7 news, the Black Information Network, and BINnews.com.
Need an accident attorney by your side? All you got to do is call the accident guys.
Injured in a car accident or at work? Call the accident guys to speak with a real expert attorney for a free consultation.
Is this the title?
This is the KBLA Sports Minute with Ray Richardson.
It was not a happy 4th of July for the Dodgers. Their bullpen gave up 3 runs to Pittsburgh in the 9th inning. The Dodgers end up losing by 2. Pittsburgh and the Dodgers battle again tonight at Dodger Stadium. First pitch at 7:10. The NBA will test its new flopping rule at the Summer League in Las Vegas. The 10-day action for rookies and free agents begins Friday. Players will be on notice players to think twice before flopping in an attempt to draw a foul. If a player tries it, the new rule gives the opposing team a free throw attempt and possession of the ball. The player also will get hit with a technical foul. The Lakers and Clippers will have their rookies and free agents in Vegas. Neither team is scheduled to play the San Antonio Spurs and their number one pick, Victor Wembanyama. Wembanyama will be with the Spurs in Vegas. No debates, no speculation, just the info you need. That's your KBLA Sports Minute. I'm Ray Richardson. More news, opinions, and conversation when we come forward on KBLA Talk 1580.
We've got a lot to talk about.
Hi, we're Tasha,
Kill,
and Euro from KBLA's Lyric Lounge.
Check us out every Saturday from 4 p.m. to 5 p.m. and every Sunday from 6 p.m. to 7 p.m.
Tune in as we break down some of your favorite song lyrics from all genres of music.
From gospel to pop and hip-hop to rock and everything else in between, we cover it all.
So come hang out in the Lyric Lounge with Tasha,
Teal,
and Euro every Saturday afternoon at 4 p.m. and every Sunday at 6 p.m.
Let the music play.
Unapologetically progressive. KBLA Talk 1580. We've got your black. This is KBLA Talk 1580. Talk radio. That's music to your ears. We're unapologetically progressive. KBLA Talk 1580.
You're listening to K-Drip, where we play all the best classic water-wasting hits like Watering Your Lawn During the Hottest Time of the Day and Leaky Faucets. They're tunes from another time because now that we face a hotter, drier future, every drop counts. Despite an extremely wet winter, keep using less water, fixing leaks, and reusing indoor water for your garden. Visit SaveOurWater.com for more ways to conserve. Up next, brushing your teeth with the water on. K-Drip.
For adults with moderate to severe plaque psoriasis who are candidates for systemic or phototherapy, now there's Skyrizi, Risankizumab Riza, a prescription-only 150 milligram injection. With Skyrizi, 3 out of 4 people achieve 90% clear skin at 4 months, and Skyrizi is just 4 doses a year after 2 starter doses.
Nothing and me go hand in hand. Nothing on my skin, that's my new plan. Nothing is everyday.
Don't use if allergic to Skyrizi. Serious allergic reactions and an increased risk of infections or a lower ability to fight them may occur. Before treatment, your doctor should check for infection and tuberculosis. Tell your doctor if you have an infection or symptoms, such as fever, sweats, chills, muscle aches, or cough, or if you plan to or recently received a vaccine.
With Skyrizi, you could achieve 90% clearer skin. Ask your doctor about the #1 dermatologist prescribed biologic in psoriasis and visit skyrizi.com or call 1-866-SKYRIZI to learn more.
Mom's early Alzheimer's diagnosis was hard to take.
And when I left the oven on, we decided together that it was time to see a doctor and make a plan.
Early detection gave us more time to seek out information and support as a family.
If you or your family are noticing changes, it could be Alzheimer's. Talk about seeing a doctor together. For more information, visit alz.org/time to talk. A message from the Alzheimer's Association and the Ad Council.
This is KBLA Talk 1580, where everybody is somebody and nobody is a stranger. You belong here.
And it is KBLA Talk 1580. Avi Bernard in for Tavis Smiley. Thank you so much for joining us on this Wednesday morning, July 5th. Hope you had a great 4th of July weekend. We are joined by Professor David Schultz of Hamline University, Professor of Political Science, and author of at least 30 books, I believe. That is just a number that is hard for me to wrap my head around, how you're able to even have the time to write that many books. But Professor Schultz, I want to ask you about some affirmative action decisions, or adjacent decisions maybe, that didn't go our way either. And you mentioned in your article San Antonio Independent School District versus Rodriguez, declaring that there is no constitutional right to education, and this is the best part, that discrimination based on wealth is not illegal. So can we dive into that decision? And I believe that was in the 70s, correct?
Correct. 1973. I actually, well, not back in the 70s, but in the 90s, I taught in San Antonio and actually knew that school district. And just to tell you a quick story here, that I had some students who were like student teaching in that school district, and that school district was claiming that the inequities in funding were unconstitutional. In the 90s, okay, so this is like 20 years after that, my students taught, I think it was like at Mark Twain High School or junior high school or something like that, a school almost exclusively students of color. There was no roof on the building.
What?
The roof, it had been damaged, or let me put it this way, essentially no roof. It was so full of holes that on rainy days they couldn't they couldn't put classes up on the third floor because there was just no room, because like it was dripping through or something like that. But I mention this because even back in the 70s, you had the Edgewood School District, which was incredibly poor compared to a much more affluent district right next to it. And it was challenged under the Equal Protection Clause, and the argument was that school funding based on local property taxes, which produced inequitable, funding, was unconstitutional. And the Supreme Court said, first, guess what? No right to education, and it's all up to the states if they want to give you an education. And two, wealth. Wealth is not what's called a suspect classification. Phrased another way, it's perfectly okay under the Constitution to discriminate against people based upon how much money they have. And that's a huge decision, because had the Supreme Court gone the other way in that case, imagine where we might be now, where it says that schools have across districts, school districts with their white versus persons of color would have to actually be adequately funded. In some sense, I view the San Antonio versus Rodriguez as in many ways effectively or de facto overturning Brown versus the Board of Education. Because remember, Brown says separate but equal is not equal, overturns Plessy. Well, essentially, what does San Antonio say? Yeah, it's okay to have unequal funding because no right to education, and this is about wealth anyhow. It's not about race, and that to me is another obliviousness, because the court fails to recognize oftentimes how race and wealth intersect. What's that concept? Intersectionality. There's a relationship between the two. And the court seems to be oblivious of that. So the reason why I bring that case up is that what I want to argue is that case, and then another 1973 decision, which said that when whites were fleeing urban areas to escape desegregation orders, what the court said is that cross-district busing or cross-district integration was not permitted under the Constitution, which basically gave fleeing white middle class the incentive to go to suburbia. And the reason why I bring this up and how it connects to affirmative action. Let's say we lived in an ideal world. Let's say we lived in that world where I could wave my magic wand, and we actually had equitably funded fair schools where people, regardless of, let's say, their race or their income, have the opportunity to excel and succeed in life. Maybe at that point, maybe we wouldn't have to have a conversation about affirmative action. Maybe. But the fact that we don't live in that world, the fact that the court's own decisions have created or exacerbated the racial inequities is what makes the reason why we need affirmative action. And then now, of course, the court, as we pointed out, last week, basically declares that unconstitutional. But the court has created its own conditions for really perpetuating racism in schools and the problems that we face today.
It's really interesting, this San Antonio Independent School District versus Rodriguez decision, in which the court declared that there is no constitutional right to education and that discrimination based on wealth is not illegal. That kind of seems to go against Plessy versus Ferguson even, because Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896 says declaring separate but equal is acceptable. But kind of this San Antonio decision kind of says, well, no, they really don't have to be equal after all. It's not saying that, but it kind of is saying that. Well, tongue in cheek. It's kind of saying that it is okay to have things be unequal, even if they are separate, because they're saying that there is no right to an education, and that discrimination based on wealth is not illegal. And that to me is like saying, the discrimination based on, if you're a poor black person, then you don't get the right to an education, and people can discriminate against you in that case, and so it's really, wow, these are decisions that I'd never heard about before reading your article, and I'm really grateful that you're able to help us understand this affirmative action case on a deeper level. But I want to talk to you about how the court seems, this is what you said in your article, the court seems oblivious to how some private prep and boarding schools give some applicants a special advantage to get into elite schools such as Harvard and Yale. And those schools have produced the majority of Supreme Court justices. And so those schools are kind of a pipeline to the Supreme Court, and the court in turn is giving them those schools a way to get people in with special privileges. But at the same time, they're saying that affirmative action isn't okay. Is this in addition to legacy admission, or are there other ways as well?
But they sort of go hand in hand. Okay, so one of the things I didn't write in the piece is that we've always had affirmative action in this country. It's called what? It's called the boss hiring, his son, even though he's not qualified.
Nepotism.
Nepotism, or colleges doing legacy admissions. And people don't understand what legacy admissions are. Is that if your parents went to Harvard or Yale, you've got a 36% chance of getting into Harvard, as opposed to the fact that if your parents didn't go there, it's like a 5% chance or something. So a lot of schools have legacy admissions, and if the schools were all white as they were, guess what? Legacy admissions perpetuate, whiteness. At the same time, there are a bunch of sort of private school prep academies across the country. I think like back east, just places like, I think it's called Andover. I can't think of the names at this point, but there's probably some like that even like it in Los Angeles, like the elite private, like private schools or something, and these become the feeders. And what I was trying to talk about is the fact that back in 1978 was when the Supreme Court first addressed the issue of affirmative action, and it ruled that the University of California at Davis Medical School could not use what the court called quotas. It could not reserve 10 slots for people of color, and said that doing so was a form of racism. What the court never talked about then have taken. For example, it didn't talk about the fact that back then the dean of Cal Davis Med School had 10 slots that he could award to whoever he wanted outside of normal admission process. Who do they probably go to? Rich donors. The court never addressed legacy admissions.
Wait, so not to cut you off, but said the dean can admit 10 people, whoever he wants, and there's no guidelines. They can have any kind of grades or test scores.
Yep. Back then, the dean had 10. So I'm going to call it discretionary admissions that he could use. They don't have it anymore, as far as I know, but back then they did, and could do it for whoever they wanted. So maybe they could nominally say, okay, your scores weren't as good, but for some reason we're going to let you in. But if you actually looked at who got in, it was not a surprise. It was legacy, but more likely it was going to be donors, rich donors. Or think about what the stories that emerged, and I'm forgetting her name again now, who went to jail. Is actually my counterpunch piece. All those movie stars who were paying a ton of money to somebody to help them get into the elite schools or something like that.
Lori Loughlin.
I mean, Orloff, that's who it was. Not Orloff, but that.
And let me just pause you right there. We're going to step aside really quickly, and then I want you to make this point on the other side, Professor Stoltz, when we come forward on KBLA Talk 1580.
The station you turn to when you've had it up to gear with cultural incompetence. KBLA Talk 1580.
JP Morgan Chase is building on the investments in California and around the country to help close the racial wealth gap and build a more equitable future. As part of JP Morgan Chase commitment, they are taking action to help improve financial wealth and access to banking in the Black community, helping more people open low-cost checking and savings accounts, hosting community seminars with supporting Black-led institutions by building awareness about financial investments, hiring community managers, and opening community center branches like Crenshaw, Inglewood, and downtown LA. Visit today, jpmorganchase.com/racial equity. Again, jpmorganchase.com/racial equity. Get the tools to help reach your financial goals. Visit today, jpmorganchase.com/racial equity. Again, jpmorganchase.com/racial equity.
Have you heard about Lendistry? Lendistry is a national Black-led small business lender that is headquartered right here in LA. Once you've started your business, Lendistry provides flexible financing options starting at $50,000 to help you access the affordable capital needed to grow. Whether financing is needed to increase working capital, acquire a business, purchase inventory and equipment, or refinance debt, Lendistry has a solution for you. Lending products range from traditional business term loans and non-revolving lines of credit to SBA 7A loans and commercial real estate financing. Lendistry's pre-application process is simple and does not impact your credit score. Visit lendistry.com/KBLA to learn more and to get started with an application right from the website.
KBLA Talk 1580. We've got a lot to talk about.
KBLA Talk 1580, connecting you with services and solutions. South Central Youth Empowered Through Action is the youth component of the impactful CBO, known as the Community Coalition. South Central Youth Empowered Through Action has chapters at almost every South LA high school. Say Yeah, as they are popularly known, is located at 80th and Vermont, but serves young people all over South LA. Under the COCO umbrella, they train youth organizers, help underserved scholars prepare for college, and work with students to help them gain admission to top universities. South Central Youth Empowered Through Action fosters teen activism, where young people have led campaigns moving tens of millions of dollars to South LA schools and forcing officials to make AP classes available to students in under-resourced institutions. SCES scholars have taken part in the March on Washington, been published in major news outlets, and been elected to city council. Long before she was mayor, Karen Bass started the program when she founded the Community Coalition. To donate, volunteer, or enroll a student in South Central Youth Empowered Through Action, please visit cocsouthla.org. cocsouthla.org. This is a community call to action from KBLA Talk 1580.
Conversations that matter. You're listening to Tavis Smiley on KBLA Talk 1580.
And we're back with Professor Stoltz. Professor Stoltz, I did not mean to cut you off. Please continue to make your point about Lori Loughlin, the actress who paid $500,000 to buy admission for her daughters to USC.
Yeah, my point is that what the court never touched back in 1978 in what's called the Bakke case is it said it never touched the other ways in which race plays out for whites. It didn't talk about the fact that we have like this legacy admissions, that there are private boarding schools that become feeders, that become basically pipelines to sort of perpetuate the sort of the whiteness of universities. And what I wanted to get at here, my point is that right from the start, from the early affirmative action cases in the 1970s, the court went down the wrong path. That it never addressed those types of issues about how white people can buy their way into college, how they have this kind of like generational legacy history in terms of being able to get into certain schools, and therefore, when the court now last week says, well, affirmative action is unconstitutional, we need to live in a again, their phrase, a colorblind society. Well, they've been colorblind. They've been color oblivious, and have turned a blind eye to all the other ways race has formed a privilege for white America when it comes to college admissions.
Wow. And there's one final thing I want to ask you about when we come forward, and it's how white women have benefited from affirmative action and why that is something that has largely been ignored by, or maybe they didn't even know. A lot of people on the right have been celebrating this decision, and a lot of those are probably white women who have benefited from affirmative action, much in the way that Clarence Thomas himself benefited from affirmative action. And he, as he always does, he kind of pulls the ladder up behind him so no one else can have the same benefit. But when we come forward, I want to ask you about that specifically, how white women have benefited from affirmative action right here on KBLA Talk 1580.
Say the quiet part out loud. KBLA Talk 1580. KBLA Talk 1580. We've got a lot to talk about.
Tired of being locked out of job opportunities and shut down by systemic racism? KBLA stands with you in fighting for the rights of black workers, and we don't black down. The Los Angeles Black Workers Center is a dynamic alliance of workers, organized labor, community-based organizations, clergy, students, and scholars, working collectively to improve the position of the black working class. The LA Black Workers Center takes a comprehensive approach to addressing the black jobs crisis. Their programs promote access to quality jobs, racial equity in hiring and retention, discrimination-free job sites, and they prepare black workers for employment in high-wage, career-track jobs. The Black Workers Center supports workers who need help protecting their rights on the job. They give workers access to quality jobs and remove systemic barriers to employment. To sign up for free career readiness training, get involved in organizing around anti-discrimination, learn about union apprenticeship programs, or sign on to a trade registry, please visit www.lablackworkerscenter.org. That's lablackworkerscenter.org. Together, we can beat the black jobs crisis. This is a community call to action from KBLA Talk 1580.
Sometimes we lose, sometimes we win. Sometimes we try to fit it all in. Sometimes we don't know what's in store. Sometimes we find what we're looking for. Sometimes we're rolling easy and free. Sometimes 1 and 1 makes 3. So much to love along this ride. That's why Nationwide is on your side.
Nationwide Mutual Insurance Company and Affiliates, Columbus, Ohio.
To my hometown, my community. Some of you have known me my whole life. Do you notice anything different about the kids in the neighborhood? Ever paid attention? You might start with gifts, money, attention. These are signs. Child trafficking is happening right here in this town. So don't just watch through the window. Pay attention. Because the more we know, the more we'll all know to say no. Learn the signs to look for and how to help at no-to-say-no.com.
Interrogating your assumptions and expanding your inventory of ideas. Let's get back to Tavis Smiley on KBLA Talk 1580.
And we're here with Professor Schultz, Hamline University, which is, as you stated earlier, in St. Paul, Minnesota. And Professor Schultz, before we run out of time, I wanted to ask you about the affirmative action piece that a lot of people are ignoring or kind of glossing over, and that is how white women have benefited from affirmative action.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And what's happened is that I'll first say that for many people, to be female is to be white. And what I mean by that is that becomes the standard in the law. And the reason why I use that is that when companies are asked in terms of being an equal opportunity employer, or schools are being asked to sort of diversify, what is an easy way to check the box? It is to check the box by saying we've admitted more women. And given the fact that for as I said before, that to be female generally means to be white. I don't mean that personally, but you know what I'm getting at here. Whiteness defines female. That's what we're getting at here, is the fact that affirmative action has clearly helped white females. And what we're going to see after this now, we're going to see after these decisions where, since you can't considerations of race now in college admissions, is that this may work to even more the benefit of white women, especially white middle class women, who in schools are saying, yes, well, we are diverse. Well, how are you diverse? Well, we're hiring more, or we're admitting more females, and those females happen to be what? White.
So they're it's kind of a cop out for them. They're admitting instead of admitting women of a diverse range, they're admitting mostly white women to kind of check that box and saying, oh yeah, well, we're diverse. Look, more women are here. So I totally get what you're saying. Professor Stoltz, how can we keep up with you and your work? Because there's so much of it, and we see you all over the place on TV, and so how can we keep up with you?
Well, the best place to go is if you Google my name, David Schultz Blogspot. I do a regular blog where I talk about a lot of these issues. So it's actually called Schultz's Take Blogspot. But if you just do Google David Schultz blog, you'll find it. I also do, as we talked about before, I do probably a couple times a month a piece that appears in Counterpunch. So if you do those two, you should be able to find me out there. And of course, if anybody wants to email me, just look me up at Hamlin University. I'm dschultz@hamlin.edu. I am happy to talk or exchange emails or whatever with any of the listeners.
And thank you so much for your time this morning and for helping us understand just how incredibly hypocritical and extreme this decision by the Supreme Court was to overturn affirmative action. I wish we had more time to kind of get into some of these other cases, and specifically the LGBTQ case that they ruled on last week, in which they said a web designer did not have to provide services to a gay couple, even though no gay couple had ever even asked that web designer to perform those services for them. But just quickly in 20-30 seconds, is that unusual for the court to I guess hear a case in which it wasn't even actually the real situation? Is that unusual?
Yeah, they're not supposed to do that. It's called an issue of standing. If there's standing or injury, if no one's been injured, if there's no conflict in the case, they're not supposed to hear it. And in case some of the listeners are saying, "Oh, I don't care about LGBTQ issues here," there's implications here for race. Because if a person has a free speech right not to provide services to somebody who's gay or lesbian, is the court at some point going to say that somebody has a free speech right not to provide a service because somebody is black or Latino or something like that? That's what we should be worried about.
Absolutely. And we're going to drop the mic on that one, because that is exactly the crux of the situation. Professor Schultz, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Hopefully we'll catch up with you soon. When we come forward, we are going to talk to Dr. Doris Molina, a professor at USC Keck School of Medicine Alzheimer's Therapeutic Research Institute, about Alzheimer's in the Black community. If you want to get involved in that conversation, ask a question or make a comment, our number is 800-920-1580, 800-920-1580. We do have a couple lines